Science Beetle.
Welcome back, students. In the last lesson, we talked about matter, and we said that matter had a certain amount of space that it occupied and that it had mass. And the reason we started talking about this is because we were trying to kind of help you understand the definition of chemistry. And recall that we defined chemistry as the study of what things are made of. So essentially, the last lesson kind of focused on the things portion of it, and that's kind of where we got this whole notion or this idea that matter has mass and it takes up space, because we're talking about the things, trying to explain that these things is what we call matter. And today what I want to focus on a little bit is looking at the last part of this, that the part that focuses on the made up of. And remember from our first lesson, we said that when we talk about being made up of something, what we're talking about here is that there's a composition involved. That is, that whatever we're talking about, this thing, is going to be composed of smaller objects or smaller things. So what I wanted to provide for you today is kind of looking at composition as a way to help you understand this second part of the original definition of chemistry, so that when you understand both sections here, the area that, or I guess the section talking about the things, which is referring to the matter, and the section referring to the made up of, or the composition part of matter, then you'll get a better understanding as to why individuals in chemistry study what they do, as opposed to kind of going into it without having a very good understanding of the very basic view of what chemistry really is. Okay, so with that, let me go ahead and get started and dive right into what I mean by being made up of smaller objects in terms of this composition idea. One of the easiest ways that I think I can help you understand the whole notion of composition or being made up of smaller parts or smaller units is going to be a little bit of a discussion that normally would happen in the biology series, but let's look at what it means to look at the human body and what it's composed. Because essentially, when we get into this idea, the question we're really asking is, what is matter composed of? We know that it has mass and we know that it takes up space, but what is it made up of? What is it composed of? And so to answer that question, we really need to dive into this area looking at the human body, because I think it provides us with something that you can relate to, because you have a body. Just like your friends have one and those around you have a body in terms of the human beings around you. And so that way you can really connect with it and kind of make sense of what some of the concepts that we're trying to share. So if I go ahead and draw a human body here the best that I can, I'm going to draw a representation of one, and then that'll give us down the discussion. So let's say we've got this human body here, and it's obviously, again, not to scale. It's not the best, but you get the idea. Essentially, you've got the body part of the head, you've got the arms, you've got the torso, and so on. Now, when you're looking at the body and someone asks you, what is the body composed of? Well, the first thing that you're probably going to say is you're going to say that it has a head here, right? The next thing you're probably going to say is that you also have one arm, two arms, and you're going to have one leg and two legs, and that you're going to have one chest and one neck. And if we want to be a little bit more particular, you're probably going to say that you have 1 ear, 2 ears, one nose, and then the two eyes that are in the center, right? So that's one way of kind of looking at what are the parts of the body. And that would be correct. But let's take it a little bit further. So at the highest level, we've got the body, right? And this body is composed of various body parts that you have identified, right? So let's call these body parts. Now, the next thing is to ask ourselves, what are these body parts? Well, it depends how you look at it. So if you look at your head's going to have several parts to it. It's going to have hair, it's going to have skin, it's going to have muscles, and it's going to have bones, and it's going to have a brain tissue on the inside. Not to mention some of the other kinds of structures located within the whole head region. All right? But if we look at it from a biological perspective, we say that these body parts are essentially are going to be kind of like organs, right? And so what I can do is I can write the organs and then ask ourselves, what are organs made up of? Well, if you remember your biology lessons, then you would know that organs are essentially just a collection of tissues, right? And that these tissues are essentially made up of a group of cells, right? And if you go a little bit further, you're going to find out that these cells then are essentially made up of various things. If you look at the cell, it's going to have many parts, so you're going to find that it's going to have a nucleus for sure, because eukaryotic cells, and where eukaryote will have nucleuses, right? And then it's also going to have organelles. And if you go a little bit further, I know you can't read that, so let me write that again. And in particular, if we look at the nucleus, we're going to find that inside the nucleus you're going to have DNA, right? And there's also a nucleolus in there, but for the most part, we'll say that we're just going to focus on the DNA. And if you look at DNA further, you're going to find that even DNA, which is very, very small, is still going to have parts that it composes the DNA molecule. And so inside the DNA, what you're going to find are three things. DNA is composed of nucleotides, phosphate groups, and 5-carbon sugars. And if I really wanted to be a little bit more, go into this a little bit deeper, I would even say that the nucleotides, phosphates, and the 5-carbon sugars are composed of even smaller components called elements. And if we go even further than that, those elements are composed of atoms, and those atoms even further are going to be composed of three things: electrons, neutrons, and protons. But for right now, let's just focus up to here, up until the nucleotides. We'll talk about atoms and electrons in a later lesson. But for now, let's just focus up to here. And if we do that, what I want you to notice is that these things, there's a progression. So if we take the body's here, and if you take the body parts, and if we look at the one body part, we're starting to get smaller. And if we look at the organ here, we're going to see that the organ that we're looking at here is, in here in the middle, maybe we're looking at the skin, and that skin has tissues, and so the tissue gets even smaller, and those cells are just a dot. And as you go further and further in, so essentially what's happening here is you're going from something that's pretty big and you're narrowing it down. You're going now to a portion of it, portion all the way down, so you get down to the very basic units, the smallest possible thing that makes up something. And that concept there is what we're talking about when we say that these things or matter is made up of something. If you can understand that concept, that matter is essentially composed of smaller parts put together, then I think you're going to understand why chemists really do what they do. Because chemists are trying to understand what things are made up of. And not only are they trying to understand what things are made up of, they're trying to understand what these little subcomponents do, how they interact with one another, so that we can help understand our world even better. And essentially that is the grandiose project, or the big picture of what chemists are trying to do. But they do it by trying to understand matter, how it's composed, and the properties of matter. So essentially, that's what I want to get for you to understand in this lesson. And if you got that, you're doing great. So in the next lesson, what I'll do is I'll focus a little bit more about what happens if we go even further and look at the two things that I talked about today, elements and atoms, and what they're composed of. All right, so we'll see you at the next lesson. Bye-bye. And one last thing, if you like the tutorials, go ahead and please do us a favor, subscribe, and then you'll have access to all the lessons that we provide here on our site. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.